I've wanted to make this video for a while, and I've made it twice now, and I feel like the third time is going to be a charm. I just feel like the first two times I didn't quite just sit down and naturally capture what I wanted to actually say. So this time I'm just going to do it raw, no script, and I have a few little notes that I'll be going off of so I don't forget anything. But other than that, this is just going to be my story. And I'm doing this video for my little girl, little Miss Charlotte. So someday when she's older, she can look back and watch this video and learn about her arrival into the world, because we had no pictures or videos. This video is going to be about my birth experience. And when I first got pregnant, I truly was adamant about trying to be as natural as possible. I wanted to not have any kind of intervention. I didn't want an epidural. I didn't want Pitocin. I didn't want a C-section. I wanted a home birth, actually. And originally who I contacted were midwives who could come to my home. None of those would accept the military health insurance that I was on at the time. So then I started looking at birthing centers where it was still midwives, no doctors, and they had baths and you could go outside, and it was a really natural experience. And loved those, but again, they didn't accept my insurance, and I just couldn't afford to pay the $7,000 out of pocket that it would be throughout my pregnancy. So at that point, I was kind of at a loss, and I ended up going to a gynecologist and having a hospital birth planned. I was really disappointed about this. This isn't what I wanted at all, but I just kind of came to terms with it and was like, okay, well, I'm doing what I can do for my baby, and I still wanted it to be as natural as possible. So when I went into the hospital birth, I still had plans to not have any kind of intervention if I could. So my OBGYN, I'm not going to mention her name or even the location of where I was at exactly so people can't pin it down, but she was very unattentive. Our appointments were very short, maybe 5 minutes max. She did all the basic vitals. She would take the heartbeat and the measurements and all that, ask if I had any issues, and pretty much if I ever brought up an issue, she'd just be like, oh, that's normal. You're cramping, that's normal. You have fluid leaking, that's normal. And she didn't catch when I told her that I had fluid leaking. At 38 weeks, I went in to see her, and I said, you know, my underwear has been really damp for about a week now, and you told me to let you know if there was ever like fluid leaking. And I feel like it's just really wet. It's not like gushing out fluid or anything, but it's more wet than usual. And she was like, okay. She made a note of it, and that was it. And she didn't check to see, she didn't test to see if there was cervical fluid. She didn't even do like a pelvic exam to see what was going on. And she missed the mark big time there, because my water had broken and it had been slowly leaking for a week at that point. And luckily this wasn't like detrimental to my child, but it absolutely could have been. So looking back, I'm very frustrated about that. But that morning I had gone in to see her, let her know that, and then that night is when I would go into labor. So I actually my labor started with my water breaking. So it was kind of one of those movie moments where it's like just water gushes out. And I was actually napping on the couch, so I wasn't moving or anything, and I had just eaten pineapple, which rumor has it, pineapple and mango will actually begin the thinning of your uterine lining, which helps initiate contractions and start labor. So pineapple did work for me, and I'd actually had dried mango the day before. So a combination of those two things maybe actually did set my labor in place. I don't know if I believe that, but it is an odd coincidence, especially at 38 weeks. So I was 2 weeks early. And I had gone into this pregnancy, my mother had given birth to me 1 week late. My mother-in-law had given birth to her, my child's father, 2 weeks late. So I just thought I was going to be giving birth between 40 and 42 weeks. I had absolutely no gut feeling that I would be giving birth early, 2 weeks. So at 38 weeks, when I was napping, not moving or anything, water began gushing. out of me. And originally I thought I had peed my pants because I had done that a couple times while pregnant, especially in the third trimester, because my daughter was so low in my pelvis that she was putting a ton of pressure directly on my bladder, and I had lost bladder control sometimes while sleeping. So it just made sense to me that I had peed my pants. So I got up, changed everything, cleaned myself up. And I remember kind of noting like there was no yellow tinge to the liquid, like no yellow color, and it didn't really smell like pee. But I didn't really think much of it at the time. I got all changed and I was still super tired, so I went right back to sleep. And about 10 minutes later, I woke up again with water gushing out. And this time I was like, okay, there's no way that I just peed my pants twice. So I had read online that when your water breaks, a way to tell that your water has broken is to put a pad or a panty liner in your underwear and then collect the liquid. If it has no yellow color and it has no scent to it, then it's probably your water breaking, because your amniotic fluid is clear, it has no yellow tint, and it doesn't really have a smell. It won't smell like pee at all. So I did that, put the panty liner on, and again went back to sleep. I was so tired. So I went back to sleep, and once again, the water started gushing out, and at this point I went into the bathroom, I looked at the panty liner, and as gross as it may seem, I smelled it. There was no odor to it at all whatsoever. So at that point I was like, my water has absolutely broken. And I called my parents, who were in a state that was, oh my gosh, like 4 or 5 states away. It was a good 12-hour drive to where I was, and let them know that I thought I was in labor. And then I sent a Facebook message to my husband at the time, who was in Iraq, letting him know that I had gone into labor. And I'm not going to get too far into my husband's involvement because, quite frankly, he wasn't really involved. He had the opportunity to Skype. He chose not to. He was being sent home for the birth, but obviously it's like so true to mom life right there, because my little one totally just irked all over the place. So that was so delightful. Oh my goodness. He was being sent home from Iraq for the birth, but I did come 2 weeks early, so he would miss it. And when he got home, he wasn't really invested in it, and that's a whole story on its own that I don't want to get into. So I was pretty much alone when it came to having anyone around. Let him know that I went to labor, and then I packed up my stuff because I had not packed. So I packed up a few things for me, and I cleaned the house a little bit while my water was gushing, which was really dumb. Then I grabbed my diaper bag that I had already packed, and I got into the car and drove myself about 20 minutes to the hospital. So I arrived in the hospital in disarray. I was wearing pajamas and a gross t-shirt, and my hair hadn't been washed, and I had no makeup on, and I had planned on giving birth in this miraculous way with some kind of loose fitting gown already on that I had brought with me, and I would have my hair done and I would look miraculous for my child's arrival. That was not the case. I arrived looking like a complete slob of a mom, which would quickly foretell what I was about to be for like 90% of the time with a kid. But that's beside the point. I got to the hospital, and at this point I wasn't having contractions that I noticed, although when they measured me I definitely would have been having contractions. I had no pain. There was like a mild cramping in my stomach, which was contractions, but I had had that cramping pretty much the last 2 months of my third trimester, so it wasn't unusual for me. I guess that cramping was always Braxton Hicks, and I just didn't know. I just kind of thought it was just stomach cramps. It wasn't super intense at all. So I got in as my water's leaking out of me, and I go up to the lady in the emergency room front desk, and I am like, I think my water's breaking. And she looked at me, and I obviously did not look like I was in labor, so she just kind of rolled her eyes. And she was pretty much like, I'm dealing with other people in the emergency room right now, and she gave me this huge stack of paperwork, and she's like, go fill this out and then come back. So while my water is leaking out of me, luckily into a maxi pad at that point, she just had me go sit down and fill out a bunch of paperwork. So I sat there for about 20 minutes, I kid you not, filling out the emergency room paperwork that they already had logged into their system because I had come earlier and already logged all my information in. So when I went into birth, I could just go straight up to the birthing ward. And that's not what happened. So they had me sit and refill out all the paperwork that I'd previously filled out. After I brought up the completed paperwork, another man came out and asked what my problem was, and I said that I thought my water was leaking. And at that point, he kind of like dinged into action because the last lady clearly had not. And he was like, oh my goodness, we have to get you up to the maternity ward right now. He brought me straight back into the emergency room, took all my vitals, my blood pressure and all that, and then sat me down in a wheelchair and had me go up to the maternity ward. So it was on the second story. He had to push me in the wheelchair, I guess, for hospital regulation. I couldn't just go myself. So he pushed me on up to the maternity ward, and they set me up in a room. And once again, like, I was entirely alone. So right off the bat, I kind of just latched onto this one nurse, and I wish I could remember her name, but it was such a dramatic experience for me that I can't remember her name. But she was an older woman, and she just kind of had that motherly vibe to her, and I just latched onto her, and I was like, she is going to be like my rock throughout this entire thing. And she was amazing. So she came in, and for the sake of this, we're just going to call her Nancy. I wish I remembered her name, but I probably shouldn't say it anyways, just in case she did something that was against regulation. But Nancy was my nurse, and she came in, gave me a gown, told me to get undressed, and she would test to see if the fluid coming out of me was amniotic fluid. So got dressed, sat down on the hospital bed, she laid me back, stuck this like little pH strip into my vagina, pulled it right back out with a bunch of the liquid coming out. She's like, yeah, you definitely have amniotic fluid coming out. She didn't have to look at the piece of paper, but she did, and she's like, okay, yes, it's confirmed. You are going to have a baby. And at this point, I had been in denial. I was like, my water's leaking, no big deal. I knew nothing about birth, really. I was so ignorant going into this. So I was like, so I have to stay? I can't, like, go back? And she's like, no, you're in labor. And I was thinking, I don't have contractions or anything. How can I be in labor? But my water had broken, so I was in labor. And at that point, she began kind of prepping me for birth. And right off the bat, because my amniotic fluid was leaking, I could not eat, I could not drink, I could not get up and walk, and I could not move from my hospital bed. So these were all things that I had hoped I would be able to do throughout my labor. I wanted to be able to eat. I wanted to be able to drink more than just chewing on ice chips. I wanted to be able to get up and walk around and be on all fours and really like work through the contractions. Could not do that right off the bat. So immediately, like, all of my natural birth plans were going out the window, and this frustrated me, and I was stressed out right away. So she was like, she went out to call my OBGYN, and when she came back, she told me they were going to put me on a Pitocin drip. And I said, I really want to do this as naturally as possible. And she said, okay. Went back, talked to my OBGYN, and I was approved to go as naturally as possible. So no Pitocin drip. Pitocin, for those of you who don't know, basically initiates contractions. It's a medicine they put in, and it helps speed up labor. So I skipped out on that. And then she began hooking me up to all the monitors. I had like a monitor on my finger to measure my pulse, blood pressure thing on my arm, 2 monitors on my stomach, 1 measuring contractions, 1 measuring my child's heartbeat, and then I had an IV put in me to keep me hydrated. And they also had an ultrasound tech come in and just check and see how much amniotic fluid was left, because I had been leaking for a significant amount of time at that point, about a week. And they came in expecting not to see very much amniotic fluid and to have to go into a C-section. But there was plenty of amniotic fluid, and they decided to just let me wait it out and begin contractions. They did measure me, and at that point I was 2 centimeters dilated. So I had been laboring, they estimated, for at least a couple hours at that point to get to 2 centimeters. At that point I didn't really feel contractions. I felt really good. I felt fine. So I ate some ice chips. I posted on Facebook that I was in labor, and just kind of relaxed in the hospital room. I didn't have anyone else. It was nighttime on a Saturday. It wasn't during a full moon, but it was during a thunderstorm. And the nurse, my Nancy, mom nurse, had told me that during thunderstorms, there's always some crazy birth experiences that go on. She's like, it's just something about thunderstorms pulls them in. And we were in the South, so south of the United States, maybe thunderstorms impact births or something. But it was a thunderstorm, and it was nighttime on a Saturday, and it was just me and one other woman who had ended up in the maternity ward that night. So I just kind of chilled, and Nancy kept coming in and kind of readjusting the heartbeat monitor on my stomach. And she just briefly mentioned one time that she was having trouble tracking the heartbeat. It kept going in and out, which she assumed just meant the baby was moving around. So I wasn't too worried at that point. And then about an hour later, she came in and she was like, I think the baby's heartbeat's struggling a little bit. We need to get you more oxygen. So she put an oxygen mask on me, and I had oxygen. Basically, I was breathing pure oxygen. That went on for about a half hour. It wasn't working, so she made me lay on my right side, and I would have to stay on that side to, I don't know what it did, but help something with the baby. So I tried laying on my side. That didn't work. The heartbeat was still going in and out. And then I had another IV put in with some, I don't know what it was, something to do with getting oxygen to her though. So now I had 2 IVs, the oxygen monitor, the 2 monitors, or the oxygen mask, the 2 monitors on my stomach, the blood pressure, and the heart rate monitor. I had so many monitors, I was tangled in wires, and I was getting really frustrated because I couldn't move, and at this point the contractions were starting to become more noticeable. Every time Nancy came in, she would be like, do you want an epidural? Like your contractions are getting stronger, they're getting closer together. And I had been fine. So I was like, no, I'm fine. I'm gonna just keep doing it the way it is. At this point, I was about 4 centimeters when I began feeling contractions. And they were intense, but it was honestly comparable to menstrual cramps. And I had always had really, really bad menstrual cramps, and these weren't even as bad as my menstrual cramps yet. So I was like, I'm gonna deal with the contractions. And the contraction would come, I would breathe deeply, and I would rock back and forth, although I had to stay on my side. And I had all the wires, so it was really hard to move. Then a second nurse came in. Nancy brought in a second nurse, and this one was not as nice as Nancy. She was very serious in everything that she did, and she was worried about the heartbeat going in and out, because it was more than the heartbeat going in and out. She knew it was the heartbeat stopping, and it was stopping around the time of contractions, which was very dangerous. So each time a contraction would come, my child's heartbeat would stop and start again. And this really scared the nurses. So they continued to let me labor naturally, but behind the scenes, probably a lot of discussion was going on that I wasn't aware of. So I still labored naturally, and I got to about 6 centimeters, and this is when the contractions got really intense and unbearable because I was on my side. So my body naturally just wanted to be on all fours, just kind of rocking back and forth, and I couldn't do that. With that being said, my body would not lay still. I got up on all fours when a contraction came, and I would rock through it. The nurses would come in and be like, no, your baby's heartbeat, we can't monitor it, we can't keep an eye on it when you're in this position, and it's not safe for your child for you to be on all fours. So they would push me back down, and I would try to finish the contraction laying down. And this was just a constant struggle, and the nurses were getting very irritated, and they kept pushing an epidural. They weren't saying that I was going to have to do it, but they were saying, like, it could save your child's life to get an epidural at this point because you need to stay still in order to continue laboring and having your child's heartbeat regular. With that being said, I was adamant against anything unnatural. And looking back, the epidural probably would have spared me from the C-section. But that's beside the point. I continued laboring naturally, and I got to about 7 centimeters, and I was up constantly, all fours. They could not push me down. I was fighting nurses. I had torn off my gown. I did not care if the monitors came off of me. I did not care if the oxygen mask came off of me. I was screaming through each contraction. It was hard, and I was like, I cannot lay on my side, and they would be pushing me on my side and trying to get me to stay on my side during contractions, and I was fighting them, and I was like, no, I can get through these if I'm just on all fours, and they're like, you can't be on all fours because your baby's heartbeat struggles in that position. So it was a pretty brutal fight, and finally they were like, listen, you gotta do this epidural, and I was like, okay, I'll take the epidural. And the epidural anesthesiologist took an hour and a half to come. So I was still stuck on 7 centimeters at that point. I hadn't progressed, but the contractions had, and they were getting more and more intense and closer together, and I was bawling my eyes out and screaming. It was intense. Finally, the anesthesiologist gets there. They sit me up. Nancy is hugging me, and as I'm sitting there, and I'm just crying because I feel like a failure at this point. I haven't had my natural birth experience. I'm getting an epidural. I'm hooked up to all these monitors. I'm in a hospital. I wanted an all-natural home birth. This is the farthest from it. And I was just bawling, and the contractions were so painful. I was tired. It was probably 1, 2 o'clock in the morning at that point. He did everything that the epidural entails, put a needle in my back, and immediately the epidural took effect, and my little one is adding her 2 cents, so if you hear her. But the epidural took effect, and I then started just laughing because it was so much relief. And I was like, okay, I'll lay on my side now. And they're like, told ya. So they had me lay on my side, and at that point, Nancy stayed in the room just watching the heart monitor, but I was so happy about the epidural, I didn't pay attention to the heart monitor at all. And looking back, it was going in and out bad at that point. And everyone else had left. The anesthesiologist stayed in the hospital, though, because they had told him, we're going to need you. I didn't know any of this. I did not know that a C-section was even being considered. And that is when a nurse came in and, that I did not know, and said, the doctor called it, we have to go now. And no one explained to me what was going on. A bunch of nurses rushed in, including the anesthesiologist, and they began removing IVs, putting in new IVs, removing monitors, and then taking my hospital bed, and they began rolling me away. And at this point, I had no idea what was going on. So as I was being rolled away, I had a nurse talking me through what was about to happen, and she was like, your baby's heartbeat is stopping. We have to go to an emergency C-section now. We're going to make this as fast as possible. This is an emergency situation. We're sorry, you have no choice. This is to save your child's life. So I was in shock. I did not say anything. I didn't react. I did not cry. I did not do anything. I was just like, can you let my family know? And I gave them my phone, and they did. They texted my mother, and they texted my husband. And they rolled me in the hospital bed with the epidural and everything still running. They rolled me to the emergency room surgical ward area. I got there, and I was like, I can move over to the hospital bed or the surgery table, like the metal table they put you on, and they're like, no, you can't, like, you've had an epidural, you can't move. But so they had a ton of people pick me up, move me over, and then just tons of nurses coming in, getting tools ready, getting things sanitized, everyone putting masks, gloves, covers on, and they put a sheet up over me so I could not see anything beyond my face, and the anesthesiologist stood behind me. He put in the anesthesia. I don't know how or where. I didn't feel anything. And then it must have been like just 15 minutes. The OBGYN that I had rushed in. She looked at me and she was like, sorry, Dawn, this didn't work out as you planned. And then that was the last I heard from her. And I just kind of laid there, and the anesthesiologist talked me through what I was going to feel during the C-section, which essentially was nothing until they were pulling the baby out, at that point, he said, you're going to feel some pressure as we bring your baby out. It's going to last about 30 seconds, and then you're going to meet your kiddo. So my daughter was very low because I was very, very close to giving birth at that time. So she was already like into my vagina, into the pelvis. And so the pressure was intense and painful, but not unbearable. But I could just feel like pressure against my bladder and abdomen, lower pelvis area. My battery died, so I had to go back, and I'm not sure exactly where I left off. I think it was the pressure in my pelvis area. And it wasn't unbearable pressure, but I did feel it. And then they pulled the baby out. There was about 15 seconds of silence, which felt like the longest 15 seconds of my life. Then a little tiny gasping cry. And everyone was like, all right, the baby's here. And they're like, what is it? Because we didn't know, we'd waited. It was a surprise for everyone. Even the ultrasound techs didn't know because she wouldn't uncross her legs. They announced it's a girl. And then they took her over to a table that was probably about 6 feet away from me, and I turned and I saw her laying there and heard her crying, and I just started bawling. At that point, I was bawling out of exhaustion, I was bawling out of relief, and I was bawling out of just utter joy to be able to meet this little being that had come into my life. And they cleaned her off, and then they brought her over. They let me give her a kiss, and then they said we need to go do the test and make sure everything's all right with her, especially with everything that she had been through during the labor. So they took her away, and the anesthesiologist was like, you want to go to sleep while they sew you back up? And I wasn't thinking, because had I been thinking, I definitely would have said no. I would want to stay awake so I could see my kid. But at that point, I was so exhausted and so out of it, I was like, yes. Put me to sleep. And within like 20 seconds, he must have put something in my IV line because I was out cold. Pretty sure it was anesthesia. After that, I woke up in a recovery room, and I was just kind of sitting there. They asked me some basic questions, my name, all of that, how much I remembered, and then gave me a couple crackers and some water. And then they had my baby come in because they wanted to try and breastfeed right away. So they had her come in. We worked for about 5 minutes on getting her to latch, and then she breastfed for a minute. Her first meal had been formula, but they were having her breastfeed because we now had the opportunity to do that. So we breastfed, and while breastfeeding, I started to get really sick from the anesthesia, and I was like, I think I'm going to be sick. And they're like, you're okay. And then I vomited all over myself and my baby. At that point, all the nurses in there were shocked, and they came over, took the baby away, and just let me fall back to sleep, which I fell back to sleep right away because I was like so embarrassed. I just bloop, shut off. Then I woke up again, and I was in a different room. I was in the room that I would stay for the next 2 days in the maternity ward, so it was like my hospital room, I guess. And a nurse came in to give me some pain medicine, to show me how to do my morphine drip. And then I asked if I could see my kiddo. And she was like, do you want to sleep, or do you want your kid? And I was like, well, I want to see my kid. She's like, most women just sleep because they need that rest. And she's like, but if you want to see your kid, absolutely, we'll bring him in. And they brought in baby Charlotte, and Charlotte would stay with me for the next 2 days and the next 6 months following that. So that was my birth experience, and I want to do a separate video about my C-section recovery and more about everything that went into that over the last 6 months. But for this video, I just wanted to make my C-section birth story. It was not what I'd planned, and I thought I was going to beat myself up so bad for having an epidural, for having an unnatural birth, for having a C-section, for having everything I never wanted. And honestly, by the time it was said and done and finished, I was like, that was a whirlwind of an experience. And I have no regrets. It was beautiful in its own way, and I have this awesome scar to show like the warrior I was getting through that, and to show my daughter what I went through to bring her into this world. It was not what I had dreamed of, but it was perfect in its own way. And I am so blessed that I got to give birth, even though it was via C-section, and I had an epidural. But I feel really blessed that I got to give birth, and at the end of the day, I got an amazing, beautiful, happy, healthy child. And I could not have asked for more from that. So that is my birth experience. I love watching these kinds of videos, but I am making this one specifically for my daughter so she can look back someday and hear from my perspective shortly after her birth of what I was going through throughout that entire thing and what it was like when she came into the world for the very first time. So thank you so much for watching. If you're on YouTube, just watching to hear the story, and if you are Charlotte someday in the future, know that giving birth to you was an amazing, amazing blessing, and it was quite an experience and one I will never forget, but it was an amazing one in its own way.